They called it belt tightening as they denied my bonus again, while congratulating themselves on discipline and values. I stood there nodding, feeling the quiet sting of being told patience was a virtue reserved for people like me. What they didn't see was the moment something hardened into focus. I stopped explaining. I stopped hoping. I started noticing what everyone else took for granted, because buried inside the routine they trusted was a dependency only one person truly understood. If you've ever been asked to carry more and accept less, subscribe and tell me your story in the comments. I stayed longer than most people would have, not because I was afraid to leave, but because responsibility has a way of convincing you that endurance is the same thing as integrity. Every morning I walked into that building carrying more than my job title suggested, and every night I left knowing tomorrow would demand the same quiet competence. I was the person problems landed on when plans failed, when timelines slipped, when customers threatened to walk. No one said that part out loud. It was simply understood. When something broke, my name floated into the room before anyone admitted there was a crisis. Over time, that kind of reliance does something subtle to you. You start measuring your worth by how much chaos you can absorb without complaint. I told myself that consistency mattered, that showing up without drama would eventually speak louder than self-promotion. Around me, others talked about their achievements with confidence I didn't feel the need to manufacture. They scheduled meetings to recap work I had already done, framed group efforts as individual wins, and learned how to smile while taking credit without ever touching the mess beneath it. I noticed it, but I didn't challenge it. Not because I didn't see the imbalance, but because I believed the results were undeniable. I believed that outcomes still mattered more than optics. Each year came with the same rhythm, long stretches of intense work, followed by calm reassurances that recognition would come soon. I kept records not as leverage, but as proof to myself that I wasn't imagining my contribution. When family asked why I stayed despite the stress, I gave them the easy answer, that I liked stability, that loyalty still meant something, that walking away wasn't always the strongest move. The harder truth was that too many people depended on the systems I touched, and I didn't yet know how to separate my sense of duty from an organization that benefited from it without ever naming it. I watched newer hires rise quickly, not because they carried more weight, but because they carried their voices further. Meetings rewarded volume, not accuracy, confidence, not follow-through. I learned to sit still while decisions were made around assumptions I quietly corrected later. Each fix reinforced the idea that I was reliable, and reliability became my invisible ceiling. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when a passing comment landed wrong, when praise was redistributed so thin it disappeared, but those moments always arrived wrapped in urgency. There was always a shipment to stabilize, a deadline to rescue, a reason to postpone the uncomfortable conversation. I convinced myself that professionalism meant patience, that fairness would eventually align with effort if I kept my head down and my standards high. What I didn't realize then was how easily patience can be mistaken for consent. The longer I stayed silent, the more predictable I became. And predictability in the wrong hands isn't trust, it's permission. That meeting was supposed to be routine, the kind you walk into prepared but not guarded, because nothing in your past experience suggests you're about to be diminished. I had my performance summary printed, tabs marked, numbers clean and undeniable. 3 consecutive years of measurable gains, fewer disruptions, faster recovery times when things went wrong. I didn't rehearse a speech because I didn't expect resistance. When someone tells you your work is essential often enough, you start believing the room will eventually reflect that truth back to you. His office was unusually tidy that morning, the blinds half open, sunlight catching the polished surface of his desk. He didn't look up right away. He was scrolling on his phone, smiling faintly, the kind of smile people wear when they're browsing something indulgent. When he finally set it down, he sighed as if bracing himself for my reaction, not for what he was about to say. He thanked me for my consistency, for being dependable, for holding things together. Then his tone shifted into practiced neutrality. This year wouldn't be the year. Again, the company needed to be careful. Budgets were tight. Rewards had to be deferred. He said it slowly, as if careful pacing might soften the meaning. I waited for the part where he explained how this aligned with the results in my hands. It never came. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward the idea of fairness, of shared sacrifice. What made my stomach tighten wasn't the denial itself, but the ease with which it was delivered, as though it had already been decided long before I sat down. I asked whether this applied across the board. He nodded without hesitation, too quickly. He spoke about discipline and restraint while his phone lit up again with a notification he didn't bother hiding. The screen flashed a dealership logo before he turned it face down. The contrast felt surreal, like watching someone lecture you about thrift while polishing something expensive. I said very little after that, not because I lacked words, but because I recognized the futility of offering them. When I mentioned the scope of my workload, the hours absorbed quietly, the problems prevented before they reached leadership, he smiled in a way that suggested patience rather than understanding. He told me I was valued precisely because I didn't make things difficult. That line landed heavier than any outright insult. Then came the word he used whenever a conversation risked slipping out of his control: emotional. He said it gently, almost kindly, advising me not to take the decision personally, as if the decision hadn't been personal at all, as if years of selective recognition were just unfortunate coincidence. The room seemed to shrink in that moment, not physically, but in possibility. I realized I wasn't there to be heard. I was there to be managed. He suggested we revisit the conversation later in the year, offering the same vague reassurance he'd used before. I nodded because nodding was expected. When I stood to leave, he was already reaching for his phone again. The meeting filed away as resolved. Walking back through the hallway, I became acutely aware of how visible some people's successes were and how invisible mine had become. Laughter drifted from a nearby office, someone celebrating a deal they'd talked about for weeks. No one noticed me pass. That humiliation wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. It came wrapped in politeness and procedure, delivered with calm authority. And that made it sharper, because it told me something I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't about timing or finances or policy. This was about who was allowed to be rewarded and who was expected to be grateful for the opportunity to keep carrying the weight. The certainty didn't arrive in a flash of anger. It crept in quietly, the way truth often does when it's no longer interested in being ignored. A few days after that meeting, I was looking for a routine file, something mundane that shouldn't have taken more than a minute to find. Instead, I stumbled into information that had never been meant for me. It wasn't hidden behind passwords or warnings. It sat there openly, almost carelessly, like someone assumed no one like me would ever look closely enough to notice. What I saw wasn't a single mistake or an ambiguous oversight. It was a clean, organized record of decisions made over time: names, numbers, justifications, patterns. As I scrolled, a strange calm settled over me, the kind that replaces denial when there's nothing left to argue with. The same people who spoke loudly in meetings, who needed reminders for basic details, who relied on others to clean up their mistakes, were being rewarded generously. The explanations attached to their rewards were vague, flattering, almost interchangeable. Leadership presence, initiative, culture fit. Words that sounded impressive but explained nothing. I kept scrolling, not searching for myself at first, just observing. When I finally did look, my name wasn't there. Not partially, not under review, not delayed, absent. As if the work I'd done, the stability I'd maintained, the crises I'd quietly absorbed had never been worth recording. That absence landed harder than any criticism could have. It reframed every conversation I'd had over the past few years, every reassurance that I was essential, every promise that patience would be rewarded. This wasn't a waiting game I was losing. It was a table I'd never been invited to sit at. I understood then why raising concerns had always led nowhere. You can't reason with a structure that doesn't recognize you as a participant. Confrontation assumes shared reality. What I was seeing made it clear we weren't operating in the same one. I thought about the times I'd been told to give it another quarter, another cycle, another chance. Those weren't delays, they were deflections. The realization didn't make me want to storm into an office or demand explanations. It drained that impulse completely. Anger requires hope that someone might listen. What replaced it was something colder and more useful: clarity. I stopped asking myself what else I could do to be seen and started asking why I was still trying. On the drive home that night, the city lights blurred past my windshield, and for the first time in a long while, my thoughts weren't racing to fix the next problem. They were steady, methodical. I replayed moments I'd brushed aside before, ideas rephrased by someone else and praised, decisions I'd guided quietly while others took bows, the way urgency always found me but credit rarely did. None of it felt personal anymore. It felt procedural, designed. That understanding shifted the ground beneath me. I wasn't dealing with a misunderstanding that needed clarification. I was standing inside a system that functioned exactly as intended, just not in my favor. Once that truth settled, something unexpected happened. The weight of confusion lifted. I knew where I stood. And knowing where you stand, even when it's unfair, is the first step toward deciding where you're willing to stay. Once the truth settled in, my behavior didn't change in ways anyone else could notice, and that was intentional. I didn't withdraw or become colder. I didn't announce dissatisfaction or start performing outrage. I showed up the same way I always had, answered questions, resolved issues, kept things moving. On the surface, nothing shifted. Internally, everything did. I stopped framing my days around approval and started looking at them as information. Every interruption, every casual request, every quick question became data. Who reached out first when something wobbled? Who stalled when I wasn't immediately available? Which decisions waited quietly for my confirmation before moving forward? I wasn't tallying favors or nursing resentment. I was mapping reality. There's a difference. I took stock of what depended on my presence rather than my title, because titles had proven unreliable indicators of value. I noticed how often I was expected to hold context no one else bothered to maintain, how frequently people deferred to my judgment without realizing they were doing it. That reliance had always been framed as trust. Now I recognized it as convenience. I also stopped volunteering explanations. For years, I'd made my thinking accessible, translating complexity into reassurance so others could feel confident without understanding the details. I'd filled in gaps instinctively, smoothing edges before anyone had to feel the friction of not knowing. I began letting those gaps exist, not as sabotage, but as boundaries. If someone asked for guidance, I gave it. If they asked for reassurance without doing the work, I let silence do what words used to. It was uncomfortable at first, resisting the urge to overfunction, but the discomfort clarified something important. My habit of rescuing situations early had protected people from learning how much they leaned on me. Outside of work, I started organizing my own life with the same care I'd always given the organizations. I reviewed my finances, updated my records, reconnected with contacts I'd neglected because I was always too busy. I didn't broadcast these steps because preparation loses power when it's announced. I also didn't frame them as an escape plan. That would have made staying feel dishonest. Instead, I treated preparation as responsibility, this time to myself. A message arrived one afternoon from someone I'd met months earlier at a professional event. We'd spoken briefly, nothing dramatic, just a mutual recognition of competence. I'd thanked her and moved on, filing it away as polite networking. This time, her note was direct. She asked if I'd be open to a conversation. No recruiters involved, no urgency implied. I didn't rush to respond. I let it sit for a day, not as a test, but as proof to myself that I no longer needed to react immediately to every opportunity or demand. When I did reply, I agreed to meet, choosing a location far from my office, neutral and quiet. The conversation that followed wasn't flattering or theatrical. She spoke plainly about growth, about gaps in her organization, about the kind of leadership that isn't loud but steady. She didn't promise rescue. She offered recognition. That distinction mattered. I didn't accept anything that day. I told her I wasn't ready to move yet, and she didn't pressure me. She simply said the door was open. Walking away from that meeting, I felt something I hadn't in years: agency. Back at work, the contrast sharpened. I watched ideas cycle through rooms until they landed on someone acceptable enough to receive credit. I watched urgency spike whenever accountability approached. Each observation confirmed what I'd already accepted. I wasn't needed because I was valued. I was needed because I was reliable. And reliability, when it goes unacknowledged long enough, becomes exploitable. Preparing didn't make me bitter. It made me calm. Calm enough to stop proving. Calm enough to wait. Because when you finally understand the structure you're standing in, the smartest move isn't to push against it. It's to decide how and when you're willing to step out of it. What leadership never seemed to understand was how fragile smooth operations actually are. From the outside, everything looked predictable, almost boring. Schedules held. Problems resolved themselves before anyone important had to notice. That illusion of effortlessness became the story they told themselves. They believed the organization had matured, that the systems were finally set, that consistency was the natural state of things. In reality, consistency was something I actively maintained every single day. Not through dramatic interventions or visible authority, but through attention, through knowing which small issues would grow teeth if ignored and which ones could wait. Through remembering patterns no report ever captured and anticipating reactions no policy accounted for. When something drifted slightly off course, I nudged it back before alarms went off. When a minor delay hinted at something deeper, I corrected the chain quietly. Over time, that vigilance disappeared into the background. People stopped seeing the hands that steadied the structure and started believing the structure stood on its own. That belief shaped their decisions. They cut resources assuming resilience would compensate. They reassigned responsibilities, assuming knowledge was transferable. They praised the idea of self-sufficiency without ever testing it. I watched as confidence replaced curiosity, as questions stopped being asked because nothing had gone wrong lately. In meetings, I heard phrases like, "The process will handle it," and "We've moved past those growing pains." Each time, I felt the same restrained urge to correct them, to explain that processes don't handle uncertainty, people do. Experience does, judgment does. But I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but because I understood how little appetite there was for inconvenient truths. The smoother things ran, the more invisible my role became. It's a strange position to occupy, being central and peripheral at the same time. People came to me instinctively when something felt off, then forgot the conversation once it was fixed. They took the absence of crisis as evidence that their assumptions were right. I saw how leadership decisions were being made further and further away from the actual work, guided by dashboards and summaries that flattened reality into reassurance. No one asked what would happen if the person who recognized the early warning signs wasn't there to interpret them. They assumed someone else would step in, that documentation would fill the gap, that experience could be replaced by procedure. That assumption wasn't malicious. It was lazy. It relied on continuity without honoring its source. I noticed how often people use the phrase, "business as usual." It sounded confident, but it depended entirely on things staying the same. And things only stay the same because someone keeps them that way. The longer I observed this, the clearer the risk became. Not to me, but to them. I wasn't holding leverage, I was holding balance, and balance is something you only appreciate once it's gone. They mistook my presence for permanence, my patience for loyalty without limits. They assumed that because I had always been there, I always would be. That assumption allowed them to stop investing in understanding, to stop asking what supported the weight they were piling on. I didn't correct them. I didn't warn them. Not because I wanted to watch anything fail, but because warnings only matter to people who respect what they're warned about. And by then, it was obvious they respected the outcome, not the person quietly sustaining it. The morning I decided to leave felt almost disappointingly ordinary. No rush of adrenaline, no sleepless night, no dramatic sense of finality. I woke up, made coffee, followed my routine, and folded a single page into my notebook before heading out the door. That calm unsettled me more than panic would have. It told me the decision had already been made long before that day arrived. When I stepped into the building, everything looked the same, which made it easier to understand that nothing ever would be. I walked to his office when I knew he'd be available, knocked once, and waited. He waved me in without looking up, finishing a call with the easy confidence of someone who assumes time bends around him. When he hung up, he launched into small talk, already framing the conversation he thought we were about to have. I didn't let it start. I placed the letter on his desk and said the words simply without cushioning them. I was resigning, effective immediately. The pause that followed was almost theatrical. He blinked, laughed briefly as if this were a misunderstanding he could smooth over, then frowned when I didn't join him. He asked what this was really about, suggesting stress, burnout, miscommunication. When I didn't engage, his tone sharpened. He reminded me of my responsibilities, of the people who depended on me, of the inconvenience this would cause. It was striking how quickly obligation became his language of choice. I listened without interrupting, not out of respect, but because there was nothing left to explain. When he accused me of being impulsive, of reacting emotionally, I felt something close to relief. The script hadn't changed. I replied with facts only, stating that I had fulfilled my role and that my decision was final. I set my badge and keys beside the letter, slid my laptop across the desk, and stood. He reached for his phone, already calculating who to call, what to fix, how to regain control. He asked me to reconsider, to give it time, to revisit the conversation later. The familiarity of those phrases confirmed I was doing the right thing. I thanked him for the opportunity and turned toward the door. The walk down the hallway felt lighter than I expected, as if the air itself had shifted. A few faces looked up, curious but cautious, sensing movement without context. At the elevator, my phone vibrated once, then again. I didn't check it. When the doors closed, I caught my reflection in the metal and barely recognized the expression looking back at me. It wasn't anger or triumph. It was release. The unraveling didn't announce itself with sirens or headlines. It crept in quietly, the same way problems always had, only this time, no one intercepted them. The first sign came through a muted vibration from the phone I'd left face down in a drawer. One missed call became several, spaced too closely to be coincidence. I didn't rush to check them. Whatever urgency had found them had nothing to do with me anymore. By the next day, curiosity outweighed detachment, and I glanced at the screen. Familiar numbers filled the call log, some marked urgent, others repeated until the device gave up trying to categorize them. Messages followed, voices tight, controlled at first, then increasingly strained. They weren't asking for favors, they were asking for direction. Without me there, small misalignments stacked on top of each other. Decisions waited too long. Assumptions went unchallenged. What had once been corrected quietly now lingered long enough to multiply. From the outside, it probably looked like a sudden failure. From where I stood, it was a delayed reaction. The kind that only feels shocking if you've ignored the warning signs for years. By the end of the week, the tone shifted from professional to pleading. Promises were made that should have existed long before desperation forced them out. I recognized the pattern even without listening closely. Crisis doesn't create honesty, it reveals what was already withheld. A few days later, I learned he had tried to find me in person. He showed up where I now worked, looking smaller than I remembered, stripped of the certainty that had once filled every room he entered. When we sat across from each other, he spoke quickly, as if speed might compensate for the years he'd spent not listening. He described losses, pressure from above, people panicking. He asked me to come back temporarily, just long enough to stabilize things. The offer was generous in ways it never had been before. I declined just as calmly, not because I wanted him to feel what I'd felt, but because temporary recognition is still conditional, and I was done negotiating my worth under duress. I reminded him that the system was operating as designed, just without the interpretation it had quietly relied on. That wasn't punishment, it was reality. When I stood to leave, he didn't argue. There was nothing left to reframe. Walking back into my new environment, I felt the contrast immediately. Questions were met with attention. Decisions were shared instead of assumed. My Presence wasn't treated as background noise. Over time, I heard updates about my former workplace, leadership changes, restructuring, explanations dressed up as strategy. None of it surprised me. When organizations confuse endurance with loyalty and silence with consent, collapse isn't dramatic. It's inevitable. Looking back, the most powerful moment wasn't the failure they experienced after I left. It was the clarity I gained before I did. I didn't raise my voice or make demands. I didn't prove anything in the way they expected. I simply stopped carrying what was never acknowledged. If there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Your value doesn't need to be argued into existence. Pay attention to who benefits from your quiet effort. Prepare your options before you need them. And when the moment comes, trust yourself enough to step away. If any part of this felt familiar, share your story. You're not alone, and your silence was never your weakness. I didn't leave angry. I left clear. What this experience taught me wasn't about revenge or winning. It was about the quiet strength I'd been building without realizing it. While I was fixing problems and smoothing disasters, I was also learning patterns, documenting outcomes, and noticing who benefited when I stayed silent. That preparation saved me when clarity finally arrived. I saw how much power lives in calm observation. No one noticed me taking notes, saving emails, or tracking decisions, but those small habits gave me certainty when words stopped working. The real strength wasn't walking out. It was staying composed long enough to understand the system I was inside. I learned that patience isn't passive when it's paired with awareness. Every delay, every dismissal, every next quarter became information. I didn't need to argue my worth. I needed to know it. And once I did, leaving didn't feel risky. It felt logical. What surprised me most was how little noise it took to change everything. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain myself into exhaustion. I trusted the preparation I had quietly done for years. When the moment came, I was ready because I had already done the work privately. That's the part people miss. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits until you're done asking for permission. If I were talking to a friend in the same place, I'd tell them this. Pay attention to patterns, not promises. Save proof before you need it. Stop over-explaining to people who benefit from misunderstanding you. Prepare options quietly, without guilt. And trust the calm moment when you know you're done. How to get started today. Write down what you handle that no one tracks. Save emails, results, and timelines consistently. Notice who depends on your silence. Build one option outside your current role. Practice responding less, observing more. What quiet strength have you been building without giving yourself credit for?